First, before we jump into the topic, so who am I? I'm Gustavo Franco, aka Stratus. I've been with Google for roughly 11 years now. I work on the customer reliability engineering team, which is part of the SRE organization, which is also partially responsible for this lounge. If you're watching here, if you're not watching at home. Let's cover some assumptions before we jump right into do you have an SRE team, how to get to an SRE team. I have a couple assumptions, and you can correct me if I'm wrong. I think hopefully most of you here are already familiar with what SRE is, and you probably at least have a vaguely understanding of the difference between SRE and DevOps. If you don't, follow that link in there to get more information about what we think of the difference between SRE and DevOps. The long story short here, and we had a presentation earlier at this conference from Sra Workbook, one of the developer relations folks, about the difference between SRE and DevOps, which I recommend you to watch if you haven't watched it yet. The gist of it is we say SRE is an implementation of DevOps. A lot more information for you if you follow that link. And the third assumption that I have is there's some leadership buy-in. VPs, C-level executives have some buy-in to either if you're a manager or if you're an individual contributor trying to adopt SRE best practices and implement an SRE team at your company. People generally agree with it. So why are we here? So first, this can be seen as a guided tour of the Google SRE Workbook. If you hadn't read it yet, we have a copy online. I'll have a link at the end. We also have some copies for you. So after this talk, towards the end, you can actually get a copy from us as part of this talk. But first things first. We're here because I'm going to guide you through some chapters of the workbook in order to get there, right? In order to get to your first SRE team. The second reason why we're here is I'll give you concrete examples. One thing that we get feedback often about when we talk about SRE with customers like yourselves is, okay, I understand the practice. I heard about SLIs and SLOs. How do I really do it? How do I get from quote unquote nothing or an operational team or a developer team that wants to adopt SRE to actual concrete tangible action? So we're going to cover some examples, some concrete examples there. Last but not least, we're here so we can use this some kind of benchmarking. So if you have SRE teams already, you can kind of compare notes with us. And I would like to hear your feedback right after the presentation through questions, or just we can go in the back and have a conversation about it. Cool. So first things first, I will go through if you're just getting started. So you're sitting here and you don't have an SRE team yet, and you're really interested in adopting SRE best practices and you have an SRE team. We're going to go through that. I'll also cover different SRE implementations, so different flavors of SRE. And I'll also guide you through common SRE practice by level of maturity. This is totally arbitrary. I made this up, right? If you say, I go through advanced, and you're like, no, my team is doing half of advanced and half of beginner, where am I at? I don't have an answer for you. I just have rough guidelines in terms of what I see beginner teams at Google doing after intermediate teams and advanced teams. And then, of course, what we should do next. So if you're just getting started, first recommendation is establish service level objectives, right? So I won't get into details of what this means, but it's, of course, you can see the link to the chapter of the book, as I mentioned before. As you're accessing the presentation, you can get a free copy of the book, or you can go to google.com/SRE to read the chapter. One thing I will say about establishing SLOs and why it's so important if you're getting started, even if you don't have your SRE team yet, is how is it that you're going to justify prioritizing stability over feature velocity if you don't know where your bar for reliability is at? Your bar has to be anything other than 100%. My colleague Jesus was just explaining the previous presentation. So hopefully some of you caught that. Second thing that we recommend folks to do is adopt Blameless Post-Mortems. It's very easy in some companies. It's very easy in some companies for people to buy into that, and in some other companies people are like, no, if someone makes a honest mistake, I still think we should quote unquote punish them somehow. If you are one of those companies, if you're working in one of those companies where people want to quote unquote punish folks because they make honest mistakes, so it's really hard to adopt Blameless Post-Mortems. So if you cannot change that culture, maybe SRE is not for you, it's not for your company. Maybe it's not gonna help you, it's not gonna work. So back to one thing to consider: establish SLIs and SLOs, establish blameless postmortems. Establishing blameless postmortems is all about culture. It's not technical, and if the company culture is not ready, you're gonna have a problem adopting other SRE best practices, basically. The third one is, once you have blameless postmortems, establish a process to manage production incidents. Why a process? Well, you don't want people to be paged at 3 a.m. You don't want to be people being paged at all the weekends, and they don't know what to do with that pager. So if you have SLIs, SLOs, you have blameless postmortems, document your process to respond to pages. We will often see SRE teams, SRE functions where people have adopted SLIs, SLOs, they write postmortems, they have the practice of writing postmortems, but when people get paged, they don't know what to do. So train your folks, establish a process, and back to this chapter covers more details on things to do there. All right, we cover things that if you're just getting started, so 3 things. But I understand not every SRE team is created equal. Maybe you're able to do 2 out of 3, and it might be okay, except for maybe blameless postmortems, because you might have cultural issues at your company. Let's talk about why not every SRE team is created equal. I see commonly 5 to 6 SRE different flavors, different team implementations. And that's where people get, quote unquote, a little lost, because they say, oh, I do SRE, but I don't do SRE quite like Google. And I say, well, how do you do SRE? And after they tell me how they do SRE, and I say, no, yeah, we have several teams at Google that are just like yours. It's just Google has an entire SRE organization. We have very different implementations of SRE inside of Google. So I'll guide you through some of the ones that I've seen, both at Google and outside Google. The first one I think is interesting to highlight is consulting. So consulting is, you may have a couple SREs, they're consulting with developers on their design, they might be consulting on code and configuration changes, they might be consulting on the instant response, on blameless postmortems, on defining SLIs and SLOs, but at the end of the day, consultants don't tend to get, quote unquote, their hands dirty with changing configuration, changing code. That's why they're called consultants. This is okay if this is all you can afford, if that's what you want to implement at your company, you can have an SRE team. Your first SRE team can be of consultants. We'll talk about some of the main risks I've seen in consultant teams in a moment. Second implementation, embedded teams. So embedded teams, you don't embed an entire team, you embed individuals of a team. So you may have a team of 5 folks, 5 SREs, 1, 2, 3 are embedded with each, right? 1 or 2 each are embedded with different developers working with them, right? We also have those at Google. So if you have this at your company, you're saying, I'm not doing SRE quite like Google. Yes, you are, and it's okay. So that's one implementation. It's totally acceptable. That could be your first team. You could have 1, 2 folks to be embedded there. Generally, the difference between embedded and consulting is we do see embedded folks going hands-on, like changing code and config. They may or may not be on call with the team. But back to, it's your implementation. You define it. You define the details. The third and the fourth one, they kind of bundle together because they tend to be similar, are the tools or the infra SRE team. So the tools or the infra SRE team is this SRE team that specializes on either a set of tools, so they build tooling for the developers, for the company, reliability tools, maybe monitoring related tools, maybe SLI, SLO related tools, instant response, blameless postmortem tools, or they could be an infrastructure SRE team where they're responsible for, let's say you're running on GKE, you have your own Kubernetes cluster. So that infrastructure SRE team may be responsible for the quote-unquote infrastructure, not the application. Slice is when you get a slice of your problem space at the company. It could be a product, right? A single product is a slice, or a set of products, a product area. So those are SRE teams that they're responsible for a slice of the problem. Kitchen sink or everything tends to be the most common that I see in other companies where, especially when they're in the beginning of the SRE journey, that's their first SRE team. So they tend to name the team after the company. So if you're a company and you name your SRE team company SRE, and I ask, what is this SRE team responsible for? You say, everything. That's what I would consider to be a kitchen sink implementation. I'll leave it up there a little bit because I see a couple folks taking photos of the implementations. We'll cover main risks and a little bit about on-call and team size, which people ask me quite a bit about. Before we get into that, one way to scale, people ask me often, right? Like, okay, what is the right implementation? What is the right mix? It depends. One thing that I've seen folks scaling some of these implementations in place, especially tools, infra, slice, and kitchen sink, is tiers of service. What does that mean? You might tell your developers, hey, you know what? I cannot be on call. I cannot do project work on everything that we have at the company. And even though I'm responsible for a slice or tools or infra, it's too much. We have too many tools, we have too much infrastructure, or we have the slice is too big. So I've seen people adding tiers of service. So you can imagine a first tier where you say, I'm just gonna do consulting. A second tier where you do project work, and then eventually a third tier where you do on call. Those tiers are defined per company. So you can write down as part of your team charter or a separate documentation where you get agreement with the developers what the tiers means and which service is going to be in each tier. It's a way to help you to scale. So it kind of goes to, you're going from 0 to 1 team, but you might be like, oh, I feel like I need 5 SRE teams all at once. You may not need to go from 0 to 5. Consider implementing tiers of services. So people ask me about team size and on-call. I'll just go through this quickly. The gist of it is Google has recommendations in the books about minimal on-call size and etc. In reality, companies tend to be a lot smaller, especially in the beginning when they're adopting SRE. So we cannot really give you a hard and fast rule like here are the minimum for every single implementation of SREs that you should have. Consulting embedded, you can start with 1 SRE if you like. If that person's not going to be on call and there are no concerns of burning that person out on call, you're totally fine. But if you have to have 24/7 on call, we do at Google recommend every team that follows the sun to have a sister team, so 6 plus 6 a minimum, or a total 12. So that's on the books. But back to it depends, right? It's a company thing. So I don't have a set formula for you. Let's cover main risks of each implementation, which I think can help you if you're at 0 team and you want to get to your first team. So hopefully that will help you to decide what should be your first implementation. So for consulting, the more consultants that you have, if you don't have anything else, it may be perceived as, the team may be perceived as hands-off because you're telling folks what to do, you're not doing it, right? So in the long run, the more you add consultants, it's really hard to scale their impact. They cannot really go deep on the problem space. People are going to be like, oh yeah, the SRE consultants are great, but we cannot have 50, 100 consultants and keep adding consultants indefinitely, depending on your company space. Back to, if you have a team of consultants and you're working well for your company, you're measuring success, however you measure success internally, that's also fine. I'm just listing the risks that I've seen them based on my personal experience. Embedded the individuals in an embedded team may suffer from lack of knowledge sharing. Let me tell you what that means. Several colleagues of mine in different companies, they tell me, because they have several embedded teams, and one common struggle is they send one SRE, they have a team of 10 people, they send one SRE to 10 different developer teams, and it's really hard to get those individual SREs back into a meeting room to share their experience. So that's a risk. If you're not doing that, then eventually those individual SREs that are embedded on the teams, they feel like such a part of the developer team they're embedded with that they struggle to come back and kind of have this SRE identity, which tends to be a problem because they're not sharing their SRE experience with each other. So something to watch out for if you adopt an embedded strategy. For tools or infrastructure, the only risk I've seen is the scope might be too narrow for what the company needs, right? If your company has several applications and you only have one SRE team and they're focusing on tools and infrastructure, it may be too narrow for them. For Slice, it's similar to tools, but one thing that it may be obvious is if you keep adding Slice teams, right, it's really hard to scale just by adding extra Slice teams, SRE teams to your company. And last but not least, kitchen sink works really well in the beginning, right? You have a team and their scope is basically unbounded, it's everything, they can help out with everything. As the company grows, as the problem space grows, that team's impact and their ability to understand things deeply diminishes. So you see the deep impact going from deep to very shallow impact. And why is that? Well, because there's just too much work to do, right? So if the scope is unbounded, so one thing that we see is people start with kitchen sink, and then they eventually staff consultants or embedded teams, or they actually start slicing their kitchen sink into two, right? So they have two slices. Cool, so now let's go back from implementations to common practice for most implementations, right? I'll give you more concrete examples based on maturity and common practice I've seen SRE teams adopting, and links to the book, so then you can kind of, as you're browsing the SRE Workbook, either on google.com/SRE or one of the copies that we have in the back, it will make more sense for you to what I'm talking about. So beginner teams, so first things first, right? Staffing plan should be in place. So how is it they're going to fund this team? How many people you need? So we talk about this in the book. The team may or may not be on call, right? So keep that in mind. You may have an implementation that does not require on call. On call is something that we say SRE may do, but several SREs are not necessarily on call. So you don't need to have your SREs on call to say, I have an SRE team. That's not a requirement. We also generally see beginner teams to start putting a release process and canary rollback where it's applicable, right? So we understand mobile applications, you may struggle to have a canary, but you have a process to which you may have a server-side feature control. So, but generally speaking, SREs tend to start being concerned about release process in that beginner stage. A playbook or a run book, right, like the most common term, is in place. And you do some kind of disaster recovery testing. So we also see often beginner teams doing some kind of disaster recovery testing. It can be theoretical in the beginning. You may not have software to do any kind of quote-unquote chaos engineering activity. And SREs may be doing at that point some kind of independent project work in the beginner phase that may or may not be visible by the developer counterparts. So this is important, right? In the very beginning, SREs may be doing work to automate toil, right, that the developers may be even unaware of. My recommendation for you is back to, you got leadership buy-in, right? Remember the assumptions at the beginning of the talk. Well, if you're just having impact that the developers cannot see, your C-level executives, your VPs cannot see, you may be doing great, but this is bad, right? So you want to have some kind of eventually project work that is going to be seen, the impact can be measured, right? So in the beginner phase, it's okay. You might be automate toil for yourself, but I would also recommend you to look into your first team. Are they doing work that positively impacts the business that can be measured and be seen by the rest of the organization? And healthy SRE teams, regardless if you're in the beginner stages, if you're just really implementing SRE best practices at the top, they have enough on-call load. Meaning, if you are on call, there are pages, but you're not on on-call overload. We have a ton of guidance on the book of what we think is on-call overload at Google. What we think what is on-call overload at Google may be different at your company. People might be more comfortable with more pages, more alerts, but maybe more comfortable with and a lot less than what we have at Google. You need to define that, right? You need to measure that yourselves. And another super important thing that should actually be the title of this talk that I see in healthy SRE teams is a team charter. So let me talk a little bit about team charters. It's the constitution, the definition of the scope of the team. Back to the kitchen sink SRE team. If you just start an SRE team and you don't have that document, you're not writing down your scope is unbounded, your scope is everything. And we hate that in software engineering. So why would we as SREs accept like, oh sure, anything the company needs in terms of work that may or may not be related to SRE, we will do. Define your boundaries, define your scope. Sure, your boundaries may move as the business needs move, but you probably want to write this down. And it's better for everyone to understand your planning, to understand your work, to understand your implementation, right? Is it kitchen sink? Is it slice? And so on and so forth. And that gets me to, you then, if you have a charter and you get the discussions that leading to writing down a team charter, gets you to have some kind of SRE and dev alignment. And that's when you're going to see the misalignment, right? Things that you disagree with your developer leadership or your C-level executives on the priorities for production and what the SLO should look like if people really buy into not aiming for that unachievable 100% of uptime. And joint planning and execution is also something that we see in healthy teams. So back to, if your developers, your executives bought into, yeah, we cannot achieve 100% of uptime. The team charter for the SRE team is great, and they're doing joint project work with the developers. So all of a sudden, yeah, SRE can be a successful implementation of DevOps. Let's go to intermediate SRE teams, right? So that's, I covered the beginning, and I cover a little bit about what I see in healthy SRE teams, regardless if they're in the beginner stages or not. Well, the SLO that you set at the top is going to be reviewed and changed, right? Generally, I recommend every 6 months or so, but then again, whatever works for your company. If you need like a rule of thumb, every 6 months, review your SLOs. The business priorities might have changed, your customers might be more strict or less strict, and so you want to review that with your business owners, like review your metrics, your objectives. We also see in the intermediate teams, they start being able to measure that they have some low volume of toil. By toil meaning the work that could be automated or some operational work that you don't want to automate at all. There are different definitions of toil. I know out there it's a contentious issue, but the way you define toil, we tend to say, well, you know, half of the time for an SRE team should be spent on software engineering related or system engineering related project work, right? Well, the other half or less is then toil. Can you measure that? So intermediate SRE teams tend to start being able to even measure that. We don't see that as much in the beginner stages. The last point here is you start reviewing incidents and the action items of those incidents, right? Because you establish blameless post-mortem practice at the beginning. So now you start being able to look at, you have the time, you have the quote-unquote the slack, right, for project work, for software engineering, for systems engineering work. You're not drowning in toil, in operational work anymore. Well, what is it that you can do with the extra time? Well, one of the things you can do with extra time is let's pause and evaluate the action items that we have for incidents and see if you are prioritizing the right things to mitigate duplicate incidents. And at the end of the day, SLO violations start to have consequences. So what does that mean? It doesn't necessarily mean a freeze, even though we recommend a freeze often. By freeze meaning stop launching new features if you completely exhaust your SLO and invest in reliability. Several businesses that I work with, they say, we can't afford to do that. What else can we do? Well, can you at least dedicate more resources to improve reliability? If you cannot stop, completely halt your pushes for new features, for new launches, because you have contracts, you have commitments, can you at least invest some of the developers' time to improve reliability? Because at the end of the day, right, if the product is completely down or is not meeting the SLOs, the customers are leaving you, so SLO violations have consequences. So that's one thing that is common for intermediate SRE teams. The consequences you have to define within your company. We do recommend pause feature launches, but I know it doesn't always happen. Some kind of capacity planning is in place, right? So if you're in the cloud, if you're using Google Cloud, you understand your quotas, you're working with your account team, and you understand organic versus inorganic growth. You may or may not have some software. SREs might have delegated that to another team, but we see often SREs being concerned about that. Some kind of capacity planning is in place. And it could be purely quota planning for Google Cloud. Last but not least, for intermediate SRE teams, I also see a lot of strategic planning. So people start writing roadmaps, thinking about like not just the next Scrum cycle if you're on Scrum or Agile, or the next quarter. People are talking about like what is it that we want to achieve by the end of the year as an SRE team. Let's switch quickly to then advanced SRE teams. Major positive business impact. At least one person, 2 SREs that can claim that because of their work, there's some major positive business impact. Back to you, if your SLIs are tuned with business metrics and SREs are working to maintain or improve the business reliability, well, it checks out, right? SREs should be able to claim some major positive impact on the business. And scalable project work, meaning SREs, if in the intermediate and the beginner phases, they are trying to tackle one service at a time, one problem space at a time, they switch to now, or some parts of your team, it starts switch to horizontal impact, meaning they don't work just on one service with one team at a time, they're starting to come up with solutions that positively impact several services, several teams, several developer partners at once. And SLO burn-based alerting is in place. This one here, I would love to have that back in the beginner's place, but I'm being realistic, right? Ideally, you would have that for like every beginner SRE team that I see, they have some kind of alerting that is SLO based. I will be lying to you if I said that's where I think the SRE practice is at. I think that's one that we should move to the beginning, and we're not there yet. But if you can help me, please work on SLO burn-based alerting. And why is that? Because if you go look at your alerts right now, and you get alerted, there's probably some impact to the system, but do you know if your customers are unhappy? And are you measuring for like how much time they're unhappy? And back to like linking to the Jesus presentation, my colleague before, about SLOs, right? You need to tune them. So if you don't have SLO burn-based alerting, which kind of alerting you have? And are you happy with your alerting? And are your customers happy with your alerting? Is it tuned with the customer experience? The last on this one is some kind of automated disaster recovery testing. So then we see folks talking about chaos engineering quite a bit, right? So it's something that I see more in advanced SRE teams where they understand what is it that they can do that is theoretical disaster recovery testing or fault injection, and they understand what is it that they're going to do in non-production systems and what is it they're going to do in production, and eventually they have some kind of automated system to stress test their SLO. Cool. So now we're at the point of presentation that people might be wondering, what should I do next? What do I do from here? So first things first, read the SRE workbook. We'll open for Q&A shortly, but if you're leaving, please get a copy of the workbook. It's by the door now. And read about SRE, read about my team. I have a link to the slides. The slides will be available after the presentation. You can just Google SRE, and there's a whole blog post explaining in details what we do. And contact your account manager if you're interested in having some version of this talk and also more information about SLOs and instant response from customer reliability engineers like myself. So SRE is working with you, with the customers. So contact your account manager about that. And right now, you can just ask questions if you have any.